So I think I won't say more. Welcome, Malene, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. I can see that I don't have that much blue writing on it because I can see there is, but let's hope it gets better. It's better on screen. Yeah. But I am going to talk about biking in Copenhagen. I'm not going to talk about... No, I won't, don't start there. Okay, I'm going to say something else first. It's interesting because what I'm going to talk about is a project on biking in Copenhagen. The whole thing we did was actually to ask the question why people bike. Because as now there is a little bit more research, but when we did that, it's research from the Danish Council for Independent Research. When we did that, it was basically the first question who asked about why people are biking, because what we have is we have statistics on how many are biking and we have ideas about why they bike, but nobody actually asked them. So that was what we had said, okay, we want to do a study where we actually try to figure out why they bike. And as you will notice from this slide, which is just to kind of frame the whole theoretical outset, there are the articles that I did, that one is not done yet, it's in work in progress, but the rest of them are done on biking. That there are none of them that are specifically talking about gender. And of course, and I'm actually putting it in that one, and this is basically because I was invited for this, that I thought, okay, now I need to kind of address it directly somehow. And there is a specific reason why I'm not talking about gender, and this is especially the way we don't talk about gender in Denmark. I wrote an article which was about the super rich and their mobilities in 2014, and I talked about gender there, but I also talked about class, because what we don't do in Denmark is that we don't talk about these differentiating concepts. We don't use them because we are a welfare society. Everybody is equal. We have an idea of this being an equal place where we don't talk about gender. And this is, I used in that book a lot of Marianne Gudstad's work on, she has this thing she called the kitchen table agenda, that we sit around the kitchen table, agree about how equal everybody is. And I would say in this sense, Denmark is actually the furthest behind, because Sweden especially, but also Norway, but especially Sweden, started picking up this gender discourse again. It's kind of much more present, but here it's not something we talk about. And because a lot of my work is so based on changing politics. I do research, but what I also spend a lot of energy on is actually talking with municipalities, talking with politicians, give presentations in different places, writing to the media. It actually means a lot for me to be heard. And to be totally honest, this is the reason why I don't use gender, because I'm already in the transportation world trying to talk about emotional stuff like freedom and community and emotions and everyday life. I'm a woman, so I would never use the gender concept, because I would always be way too afraid that people would just, a lot of the men that I'm meeting out there, because it's mostly men, they would already close off from what I was trying to say. But if you look at the work that I did, if you look at through gender literature, when people theories on gender, what they say, what gender theory does, what it is that it picks up, what kind of things it looks into, this is basically what I'm doing. Because the kind of concepts, the things that are more about these emotional everyday life patching together, how we get life to work, is basically where my whole interests lie. But if you look through my papers, you would see she's not using gender, and that's true. It's not there outspoken. But now I'm going to do it, because now I'm getting old and I don't need to be that afraid anymore. So now I'm going to push it a little bit more in the foreground, because it is basically part of the way I'm thinking, and I always have been thinking. But it is a problem. It is a problem talking about gender in Denmark. There's nothing more to say. It's just a problem. It's a sensitive issue. But what my theoretic, because I'm basically not going to talk about more than this slide. I put on some sources so you can see where it is. I put on the articles so you can see how I'm framing the arguments in the articles, because I'm basically going to spend the time on talking about Copenhageners and their relationships to the bike. But it is from an outset, and what Mimi said, and also networked urban mobilities, like this way of how to understand the city with mobilities in front. This is how we organize our lives. The Mobile Risk Society, late modernity, living in a risk society where we constantly have to think about all the risks that are out there, what they mean for our lives, this constant reflexivity that is expected, the individualization of everyday lives. And then I have an everyday life concept, which is probably also good for you to know, which is basically about thinking about everyday life as the whole that surrounds our life. So everyday life is not something that's over there and then we have work and then we have other thing. Everyday life is basically everything. And what is interesting about everyday life is actually how we knit it together, how we connect the different activities that we have in everyday life. And then I have this thing about emotions, about ethics, and about storytelling. This is very related to the whole planning. I have a transdisciplinary education, and then I kind of started out in the transport with the transport people, and then it didn't really bring me anywhere. And then I moved more into the planning discourse because it was actually easier to get the mobilities perspective into talking about planning cities than it was getting the mobilities perspective anywhere within the transport research world, because it is so based on specific methodologies and ways of thinking. And within planning theory, I think that this whole idea behind storytelling, or the argumentative turn, that the way we talk about cities, the way we talk about everyday life, the way we talk about mobilities is a big part of how it actually gets planned. And this is basically also about politicians and planners and who are making the laws and how are they doing it. It's a different way of talking about discourses. And then I have these kind of abstract things, which was also based in the biking project. Freedom actually wasn't in the beginning. I did some work on cars and freedom and public transport and freedom, and I didn't want to do any more freedom when I did the biking project, but I couldn't get around it because it kept coming back. So I ended also working with freedom when I worked with biking. But the understanding of freedom and its unfreedoms, and the way we kind of label specific ideas on freedom to specific things, and why we do that. Communities as both an opposition to individuality, but also of a way of understanding what community actually does in relation to our ontological security. And that ontological security is basically the driver for the way we do praxis in everyday life. And I should also say that the reason why in some of my earlier work you would notice that I use the word behavior, but I don't do anymore. Now I use the word praxis, and the reason for that is basically development within also the mobilities turn and praxis theory, that it can be discussed. But in the praxis word lies an idea of an interaction with materialities. And whereas the behavior word is a word that comes from psychology, which is basically about thinking that people just need to think about it in a different way and then they're going to act different. So it's about changing their cognitive perceptions of things and then they change. But the praxis word actually has this understanding that is also within the mobilities paradigm, that we need to understand how these things interconnect with each other. And then, of course, the whole utopia discussion, because that's basically about thinking about how can we get people to do things in a different way. And what utopia offers is actually, it offers a direction, it offers a place to go, it offers something to steer towards. And we need that if we talk about praxis in everyday life. The research is qualitative research fieldwork. I did ethnographical fieldwork. I was part of an activist organization. I did a lot of interviews, focus groups, very dispersed in age, and then I did one focus group with 14-year-old as well. This is the things I asked about: everyday life praxis, rationality is created, freedom, community, right to city space. How do you actually, why are you biking in Copenhagen? What means something to you? This is just the last theoretical slide. Now you're not getting any more theories, but it's basically a way of saying, one of these things that I've been interested in looking at is this: is it cycling identities or cycling cultures, and can you actually separate these two things from each other, or are they interrelated? And it produces particular meanings, it's politicized practice, it's a cycling citizen and cycling associated to social identities, and as national identity as heritage. And there are some of these things that are, especially national identity and heritage is a very Dutch-Danish thing. I haven't seen any work that's done on it where it's found anywhere else in these two places. I don't know if you know anywhere else, then no. But the rest of it, I would say, is actually pretty much the same everywhere in different variations and different degrees of it, where you find there is a lot of things where you find the same things, no matter where you look at cycling. But there are very different variations of how much space it actually takes up and the significance of it. But to start with the first thing I want to say is based on this article where it was about searching for ethics and responsibilities for everyday life mobilities. Is basically something that comes from there is one thing you very often hear is that people don't choose modes of transport based on environmental concerns because they actually don't really care about the environment. They say they do, but they don't really. And I had this feeling that this is absolutely not true. There is no doubt that whenever I've been doing interviews, these ethical and normative considerations, they show up in conversations about everyday life practice. It's a part of the way they talk about their life, what they do and how they do it. But the responsibility, the ability to respond to these concerns that you actually have in your life, they can feel quite low for the Copenhagen cyclists. It's present in their life and there is a need for living it out. But it feels difficult to do something about it. They can do what they do individually, like take the bike instead of the car. One thing I should probably say about Copenhagen bikers is that most people in Copenhagen are not just bikers. They bike, they drive car, they use public transport, so it's basically all transport modes that are there. So they can have different roles depending on what kind of mode they're using. But there is no doubt that the car is seen as the superior mobility even in a cycling city like Copenhagen, and that hinders the responsibility, the ability to respond, because it is the way the city spaces are designed, the way that discourses or structural stories, because there are more micro discourses about what the good parent is, what the successful worker is. There is a car still related to that, even if more and more people are biking. And last year was actually the first year where more trips were made on bikes in Copenhagen by Copenhageners than by car, which is a very big thing. But it still doesn't change the fact that the car ownership is still increasing. So they bike more, but they also buy more cars that is standing on the parking lot, because it is part of who you are. Mobility research has the opportunity and also a responsibility to counter dominant understandings of mobilities of modernity through its ability to understand how new types of communities challenging ethics and local global responsibilities are also part of mobile lives and can help transform positive futures. What I basically try to say in this is there is actually a lot of opportunities within the biking culture to even though if it's not the Copenhagenizing thing, but it still has a lot of potential to actually think about how new ways of being mobile in the future can transform the future cities. Because what we know about car driving is that 30% of all trips is less than 3 kilometers and 50% of all trips are less than 5 kilometers in Europe. And that is a huge amount of trips that can actually be transformed into something else. And what the people in Copenhagen are showing is that they are doing what other people are doing in cars, they're actually doing on bikes. They have cargo bikes, they transport kids, they buy groceries, they do all the stuff that we say that you need a car. Normally you say when you have kids you need a car and you need that for doing it. And this is basically then when I did here is that I took up the concept of structural stories again. I made a lot of work on structural stories in relations to cars and public transport. The idea that Copenhagen is the best cycling city in the world is strongly embedded in cyclist stories about Copenhagen. They have a self-narrative about that, and that is a way of creating a community that you're part of and creating a structural story that we agree on. We are cool, we live in Copenhagen, we all cycle. The infrastructure is good, and the cyclist is framed, and they frame themselves as an important part of the city, as a living organism that defines the city space. And there is no doubt that the infrastructure is good in Copenhagen and it matters. But of course, it's not the only thing that makes Copenhagen into a cycling city. I touch on a little bit on that there, but there is the whole historical perspective of what happened during the 70s. Copenhagen was a poor city. We didn't get all the infrastructure for cars into the middle of the city like they did in, for instance, Stockholm. So there's a lot of historical perspectives on why Copenhagen actually developed as the cycling city it is. But one of the things that is very clear in the when I did this structural stories on cycling is the structural story about how, because one of them was it's dangerous for kids to bike. It plays an important role when attempts to limiting car use and parking places close to schools are discussed, for instance. One of the very strong stories about cars is when you have kids, you need a car. One of the things that came out in the cycling interviews was that it was basically the same way of reproducing that story, but by talking about how dangerous it is for kids to bike in Copenhagen traffic. And it also is sometimes, so I'm not saying it's not. Those of you who don't know the idea behind the structural story, the whole idea is structural stories are kind of micro discourses that we use in order to tell a story that we kind of everybody agrees on. So we don't have to explain why we do certain things or rationalize it. This is just something we agree on and this is how it works. The structural story are very often an expression of something that goes on in your everyday life where this is how it works and this is that we need to take serious that this is how it works. The problem with the structural stories is that they're getting reproduced constantly and we reproduce them through the media and to the political system. And what I especially found when I did the work on structural stories and cars is that people then go out and buy a car before they have the kids. So it's not the need that they experience, but it's an experienced need on what it actually means to be a family. You need a stroller, you need a changing table, and you need a car. And this is also how politicians and planners, they reproduce specific ways. So this is the idea behind the structural story. And it turned out, the other one was about the egoistic cyclist. And that also feeds into the necessity of driving kids to school and leisure activities. So what I actually realized when I did this work was that the way people talk about cycling is actually basically supporting the whole automobility agenda. Or this role the car has as the strongest and most powerful and most dominant mode of transport. This thing about the egoistical cyclist is also about the young men in lycra. It's about speed. It's about all these things, and there is much more to say about that, but I'm not going to do it. Then I have this whose commons are mobility spaces. That was basically trying to then look at how does it feel as a cyclist that you constantly have to fight about space. Because one of the things that I say in that article before, when we talk about egoistic cyclists in Copenhagen, is one of my main arguments is it's not because people are egoistic, it's because the Copenhagen municipality had so much success, so now so many people are biking, so there's actually very limited space on the street. And when you don't have enough space, you start fighting for it. This is the same thing people do when they're driving cars. So this is basically what it's more about. It's not about people being selfish or being rude or don't think about other people. It's because they feel that they don't have enough space to move on. What is interesting about cyclists in Copenhagen is that they don't adopt the attitude or politics of resistance that characterize cycling cultures in many other cities. I think it's part of this who we are as this cycling city and how cool everything is. So there are very few of these kind of movements that have any kind of resistance or confrontative in them. The approach is polite, it's collaborative, it's keeping with the Danish equality mentality, which doesn't allow for any outspoken inequalities. We don't say it out loud. It's the different kind of cyclist organizations that we have are also part of the established not legal system, but decisions in political and planning system, they're part of that because they're invited in. So nobody does any kind of conference or discussion of allocating city space without inviting them in. But that also means that they don't go in and take the hardcore conflicts. Copenhagen cyclists have a clear sense that they do have the right to city space in practice, in law, and as materialized in the built landscape. They would like this right, which they understand as a common good, to be expanded and more deeply embedded in praxis. One of the things that is also special about Denmark, and also Copenhagen then, is that cyclists are part of the traffic law. So it's written into the traffic law what rights you have as a cyclist. If you get into an accident with a car, it's always 25% is always the car's blame. Always. Even if the cyclist goes straight in front of you and you can't do anything, you still get 25% of the blame as a car driver, because you're supposed to look out for the cyclist. So in that sense, they do have a right. But the sense of pride in Copenhagen's status as the cycling city contributes to this strong sense of we that also arises from the asymmetrical structured antagonisms that arise between cyclists and motor traffic on an everyday basis in Copenhagen's overly congested transportation environment. And it is. And you could say they succeeded themselves to death. Can you say that in English? Because you say that in Danish. They were so successful that now they actually have a problem, because there are so many people on the bike path. And I don't know how many of you tried to bike in Copenhagen, but there are a lot of stretches where you can be at least 3 lines. So kind of the inner line, the middle line, and the outer line, depending on what speed you're driving in. And I'm not going to talk about this focus group I did with the 14-year-old, but it was really interesting, and it was about written and unwritten rules, and they had to put a hierarchy on which rules were written and unwritten. They actually thought an unwritten rule was bike lights. This is the only thing I ever invented after doing focus group. I never do that, but this time I had to say, you need to know that bike lights is actually a rule, and it's by law, and you have to put it on, and there's a reason. Because for them, that was a little bit unwritten, but the most important thing for them was the most important rule that they listed as number 1 is that you look back before you overtake, because it is one of the most important things to actually know in Copenhagen. You don't overtake without looking back, because you are a danger to yourself, but also to other people. And that was actually quite interesting talking to them about that. Then there is this thing about actually handling this, because this also happens when you work with cycling in Copenhagen, is that I'm actually not an anthropologist. And I thought, okay, why is anybody inviting me into a handbook of anthropology in the city? And there's no doubt that I checked on several levels. I'm a woman. I'm from Scandinavia and I work on cycling. So it was kind of, I kind of got, okay, but you could argue that I also do a little bit of anthropology, but I'm not really an anthropologist. But nevertheless, they asked me into this book through a shift in focus away from individuals as rational economic beings when deciding which mobilities to use in everyday life perspectives on the embodied and emotionally driven practice of everyday life mobilities, they become visible. This can help planning to create storytelling that respond to the needs and aspirations of citizens and politicians when suggesting alternative mobilities futures in the city. This is where the freedom came back in, because one of the things that popped up when I was talking to people was that they all remembered their first bike. Everybody I was talking to remembered their first bike, and they started talking about it, and they could lively, it was an accident luckily on the first interview I did, that the person started talking about it. Then I thought, I'm going to ask, and everybody remembered it, and they could tell details about how it looked, what kind of stickers, what they did with it, what they used it for. The interview I had with the 70-year-old lady, she actually couldn't remember it when I first asked, but the minute I came home, there was the longest email from her where she was explaining all details about this bike. And what I found particularly interesting was the way people talked about their first bike is the same way people talk about their first car. This is where you grew up. This is the first sensitive feeling of freedom. This is where you explored the world around you, where you met new people, and then I thought, okay, there is something extremely interesting in why this sense of freedom, of growing up, of being an adult is always linked to the car, when we can actually find exactly the same things in the way people are talking about their bikes. The quotes on freedom from the cyclist draw on the exact same symbolic, emotional and effective elements, most often related to cars. The interviews remembered the look of the bike, like identity, how they modified it to look a specific way, expression, and how this grouped them into relations with others. So this is one of these things that I'm actually trying to pick up in this, that this freedom comes up all the time. And I should have known it, because of course it does, but it is, I think this is the most interesting thing for me about freedom in relations to the bike, is why this is always that positive value that you can't find anybody, I think, that you talk to that wouldn't have some kind of positive connotations in relation to what freedom means to them. And this value is most of the time related to the car. And one of the other things that actually comes up in the cycling interviews is this being able to go wherever, whenever, and to go on explorative adventures autonomously is a strong narrative about the bike, and also the first bike. And this is also some of these narratives we always hear about the car, because you need the car in order to be flexible, in order to be able to do things, and the same kind of narratives actually shows up on the bike, which I also found quite interesting. And this is the last one. I'm not done with it yet, so maybe that's a little bit more shaky. I'm working on it for a book that Till is editing. In Copenhagen, cycling is definitely used strategically as part of urban development. The Copenhagen municipality used the strong cycling community as a part of a strategy to create a more livable city. The international city competition is very high on the line. We have this really funny story of getting a very liberal, car-loving foreign minister that had to go somewhere, I can't remember, Slovenia or something. One of his first things he had to do after being a foreign minister, and actually stand there and talk about how fantastic biking was and how cities needed more biking. And everybody knew that he was a totally car, but he had to do that because this is part of the story we tell when we go out of the country. Copenhagen's everyday cyclists, they are not visually identifiable except by their bikes. They are not associated with stereotypes, images, or visual signifiers like lightwear and helmets. They can be there. And we also have this Cycle Chicks website. It's part of the whole Copenhagen Nice idea. So there are, but it's not, you don't get into a specific group of anything based on how you're dressed. You can have a suit on one day and lycra the other day, and casual clothes the next day. So it's not in that way identified. It's mostly through the everyday organization that gender unfolds in relations to cycling. So it's basically not, you could argue that Cycling Chicks is gendered, because it is. But I would say it's mostly when you talk about what is it that the everyday trips that they are making. This is where the gender aspects mostly come up. I actually don't know if there is this, I had never heard anybody mention this this aggression thing, like at least not in a sexual harassment way, but there are gendered things, but yeah, but that could be interesting to figure out if you actually ask for it, if you would get some answers to that, because I have never tried that. We know that, for instance, there's this myth in Denmark that women get more hurt in traffic on bikes than men does. And that's true. But if you look at the number of trips they take, they don't get more hurt. But that's because women bike more than men do. They take more trips on bikes, so that's why they get hurt more. But that doesn't mean that they're worst cyclists. It just means that if you instead looked at the number of trips they're taking and then compared how much you actually got hurt in traffic, you would see it was the same. But this is what it is with statistics. We can use them for a lot of things, but we can also misuse them for a lot of things constantly. And it is also the way in Denmark that men are driving longer, but women are making more trips, and they are making more trips on bikes. And if there is one car in the household, it is most often the man who's using it and not the woman. So we have the same kind of things going on here. The small everyday movement that knits together the patchwork of modern family life is seen as stasis. That's one of the things I thought about a lot when I read into this whole gender thing. When the fact is that women have more trips. If we look at the numbers, they have more trips. Men might drive longer, but there is no stasis in the many trips women predominantly do to get everyday life to work. And I think it's one of these very different things going on when you talk about gender and you talk about mobilities, because they're not having these long 1.5 hour commutes, but maybe a lot of these small 10 minutes that doesn't, then it's seen, because it's that close proximity of the home, it's understood as stasis, as if they're not really getting out there, not very mobile, they're not doing a lot of things. But the fact is that they're actually much more mobile than a lot of their partners, because they're doing all these small things that makes everyday life work. And then I just took a few arguments just to give you a little bit of the qualitative, because I think that's always interesting, at least when I'm the one listening. This first argument, it's basically just to show you how gender pops up without actually having anything to do with the argument. It has nothing to do with, I asked this person about what kind of different modes she was using, and then she was talking about biking and blah, blah, blah. The total bike lover, one of those persons who uses that bike trip home. Sometimes she bikes longer just to clear her head and move her body and get into a different phase of her life. So for her, it's like really, really important. And then but then she moved on to talking about the metro, and this is what happened when I didn't ask any, she was just talking. So this is what happened. She says, sometimes it's difficult for me to leave work because I want to do the last thing. I have a lot of female colleagues with kids, and they make me stressed because they constantly ask when I'm going home, because they think I shouldn't work too much. I have flex time, so I don't work more than they do. Then it's just really nice with the metro, because then you just jump on it and are home very fast. And why do I think that's interesting? I do because this thing that she's home fast has nothing to do with the fact that she's staying at work and she's getting annoyed with them, because then she could just leave and then bike home in 1.5 hours, because they wouldn't know, because she would be away from work. So in that sense, what happens here, and this is one of these things that I think we always need to be so attentive to when we are doing quantitative analysis, they can help us with a lot of things, but they also sometimes totally miss out the point that this thing about the metro has nothing to do with this thing she's experiencing at work, that she feels she has to leave, because at work has nothing to do with how she commutes home. And these things shouldn't be, and I just took it here because I think it's really interesting. And I think when I look at my empirical, actually mostly where gender shows up. It doesn't show up like the direct link to the explanation, but more somewhere in the middle where it has not really anything to do with it, but it's one of these emotions that comes out because it's a little bit related to some other things. And this is where I see it a lot. And maybe that is because we have this thing in Denmark that we don't talk about gender out loud. Then there are, of course, quotations like this. I totally love it when I'm cycling along the highway and then all these cars are standing still and I fly past the car queue. I also note that one needs to buy a fast e-bike. One cannot ride a woman's bike because all these young guys who drives in front of you when waiting at the intersections, because they think that you won't start quickly and in high speed. Then they come along with their male genes. I don't know what is it that make them think they should drive in front and cut your front wheel, and then one needs time to overtake them again. It's almost dangerous. I don't know what's wrong with their distance assessment when they are riding a bike, and it's always the young guys. I also have a few of these, and this is the speed discussion again. And
is it men or women?
It's a woman saying it, yeah. Okay. And this is also why she's saying this thing that you can't have a woman bike, because it is also one of these perceptions that you see. I did a lot of filming with GoPro cameras when I did the biking interviews, and you can see that there are an expectation of women being slower in traffic than men, and I think a lot of time they also are. Not all women, you can't kind of segregate that much, but there are more of these fast riding guys who jump off the bike pack out on the road just to pass all these people that they're expecting to be slow. And then there is this thing with kids and bikes, and the reason why I keep coming back to it is because we know that it's insanely important for what kind of transport modes people are going to use when they grow up, what they learned as kids. We know from the statistics, and I just said we can't always trust them, but the statistics shows that when kids have been moved around by bike purely when they were kids, that's how they're going to move around as grown-ups. So it is actually really, really important that we teach the younger generations to move in different ways. Copenhagen is not designed for cyclists. kid cyclists, because the cyclists are so tough. The cycle traffic is so intense, and people just need to get going because they need to pick up kids or buy groceries, so they don't take care of kids on bike and traffic. It's a little grotesque that this isn't how it is. I feel it's unsafe for my child. If my child have to drive in rush hour traffic where people cycle in multiple layers and merge in and out between each other. It's interesting. One of the interesting thing about this is actually that that's a woman too. She's reflecting on the reason why people don't take care of her child is because they're busy, so they have to go pick up their own child. So it's not even expected from other moms or dads that they think about it. And I think that's a little bit rough. But this doesn't take away the fact that this is how she experiences, and it has something to do with then how she then acts. This is another woman, I have to say, it is the women who talks about kids in traffic. It's not the men. I don't know why, but it's not. When I pick up kids and buy groceries and transport kids to play dates, it's always on bike. Most of the time in cargo bikes because it's too dangerous for the kids to bike. I think it is actually one of the big issues that we have in Copenhagen right now. It is one of the big challenges because we've been so successful that I think an increasing amount of people, I have 2 kids. My son is 14. He started biking on his own without like grown-ups when he was 12. And he is still one of the only kids in his in his class that cycle on his own. And that's actually quite, I mean, it used to be like 10, 12 years, you say this is when they start cycling on their own. So there is definitely, it looks like, haven't seen any numbers on it, but I can see from the people I know with kids in the same age that there's actually a lot of their friends who are not biking. And then it's also Copenhagen, so there's buses and there's the metro, there's a lot of opportunities, but it actually means that they don't bike to and from school because I think a lot of parents feel that it's really unsafe. Transport research presupposes that cycling and movement in general is a rational process that can be predicted and changed through determinants like as cost, times, quality of infrastructure. We make better bike lanes, then more people bike. But what mobilities research has done is put focus on how cycling is an embodied practice that produces particular meanings essential for everyday mobility practice. Meanings, emotions is so important to what we do. One of the things that I know from my previous research is you always tell best case stories about the mode of transport you're using and worst case stories about the one you're not using. Because in that way you kind of make sense of how you patch your everyday life together and why it works the way that it do. So it's not enough to have more buses or more trains and then the car people are going to think, no, I'm not going to take the car anymore because now there are 2 more trains an hour. This is not how it works because it's their whole everyday life that's organized around this mobility, and we really need to think about if we want them to change the organization of their everyday life, how do we do that? And that's not a rational explanation. And then it's just these things that I am working on and I find so interesting is, I think this thing about city branding and global competition is really interesting because what I see is that the biking is part of it. This is pictures from the most livable cities in the world. This is all cities that have a lot of cars. Because I took the American, Australian, Canadian, where there was most of these cities from that region. But what is pictured is this like people hanging out, there is graffiti, there is like the water, especially love this, it's a road along the water where there's normally a lot of traffic, the only thing you see are 2 bikes on it. So what I find extremely interesting, which is also related to this, which is architectural drawings of a specific area that looks like this. Nobody knows it's the same place, but it is. Because this is this way we represent what cities should be, how they should look, what is it that we're selling to the politicians. This is when the architectural firm go to the politicians and the planner and the city architect and the citizen meeting, this is what they're selling. And this is very often what they end up getting because all the money that has to be put into actually creating these spaces and all the restrictions that a space like that demands on cars is not what comes out of it. Because also in Copenhagen even, and especially in Denmark, putting any kind of restrictions on cars is still extremely difficult. So the cycle and the cycling city and the Copenhagen nice perspective is used very strongly in the international city competition, and we are a good cycling city, but a lot of it is actually also a product that is used in the neoliberal economies in order to actually sell specific goods, which I think is interesting. But it's interesting is that people buy that one, so that's actually the one they want. The planners and they also want that one. The politicians also want that one. Then there are all these, as John would have said, the system of automobility and how it's all powered up in different kind of relations where we hardly cannot figure out what is actually going on there, that makes sure that this is actually how a lot of our cities end up looking still. And then there is of course the thing about automatic cars, because it's one of these things that I think is so interesting these days, and it's a totally technocratic solution. It is, I don't know, you should go to YouTube and then you should watch movies these different car companies are making. Because this one is from Toyota, it's especially horrible. I think it's one of these where it's creepy. Who want to live in that city and live that life, and everybody is so happy. And the coolest thing is how people are neatly ordered in city space. You see how they neatly order themselves. I mean, I'm not talking about all the ethical power that Mimi just mentioned, because they are definitely part of this whole thing, who is actually deciding if it's the old couple on the sidewalk or the 3 young boys who cross the street without being allowed that's going to be run over. And right now it's actually the big like Siemens, these kind of companies who are just making these decisions. And what I always do, because I'm actually asked a lot to come out and talk about this automatization for some odd reason, but it's probably because I'm the only one who then comes up with this picture and says, this is how it looks now, and now you can't see it, but this is it's cars, it's bikers, it's people walking. It is one big mess of people in the streets, because these are the kind of cities that we would like to have. Nobody want to have these ordered cities. And what are they going to do with the bikes in that automatized idea? Are we all going to ride around with bikes with sensors on, so the car knows where we are? Think about how unruly people sometimes are in traffic. Is that going to stop? Are we going to stop being that unruly in traffic? I think it's one of these things that is, it's really interesting. And the last thing I just want to say, and that was actually to pick up on the pedestrian and the walking thing, because I think that's actually also one of the very big issues we have in Copenhagen, is this thing about the rights of the pedestrians. Because we had a huge discussion. We have this Christiania. All of you, does anybody not know what Christiania is? Christiania is this free city in Copenhagen where it's the old military. It was an old military base that was closed down, and then in the 70s it got occupied, and then it's the free city of Christiania, which is basically its own small city in Copenhagen. It's not anymore, because then some things happened, but in theory, and now they had to buy it from the state. But the whole thing is organized is like one of these flat democracies. What is that called? It's called where everybody has to vote about everything. So it's not representative, but this, what? Basic democracy, yeah. And one of the things that happened was that the Copenhagen municipality, they wanted to make a fast cycle track, because now we have this thing about this fast cycle tracks, and they wanted to take it through Christiania. And the people of Christiania was arguing against it. And that ended up being a story about how the people of Christiania was not being fair, and how they were not being inclusive, and how they were only thinking about their own rights, and blah, 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 blah. And there are definitely issues with a lot of people living in Christiania. It's a car-free area, parking their cars on the outside of Christiania, so it's annoying for everybody else who's living around them. But the other thing that nobody actually took up the discussion of was that you have always been allowed to drive in Christiania. It's a car-free area, it's a pedestrian zone, but what the municipality did was they wanted to put a high-speed bike track through a pedestrian area. And this is basically what happens all the time in Copenhagen now when we're doing this. Also, there has been a lot of discussions along the harbour front because we got all these new harbour bridges where they actually place the bikers, because biking is a different pace than pedestrians. And I think that what you see in a lot of cities around the world where there's not segregated bike lanes is that you put the bikers on the sidewalks with the pedestrians. But this is actually what they're doing in Copenhagen right now, because they are right now in the place where they have to take the fight with the cars. Because we cannot make more space, then we have to take down some of our old houses. Nobody want to do that because we have an old city, we want to keep it. So the only thing that's actually left is taking space from the pedestrians or taking space from the cars. And so in that sense, we're actually in a really interesting place right now, because so far, I would say they've been trying to take away space from pedestrians, but people have been fighting back. Which I think that's actually where we see the resistance. It's actually the pedestrians now who are also bikers and car drivers, but they're actually the ones now trying to protect these low pace areas that we have in Copenhagen. I think the last one was a film. I'm not gonna. That was just if there was any of you who never biked in Copenhagen, I have a film, because sometimes when I go out of this place, I have to show people what it actually means, because you can tell stories about biking in Copenhagen, but if you don't know how it actually looks when you do it. Yeah, that was it.
Thank you so much for this tour around, both in the theoretical and practical and everyday life in Copenhagen. And I think we have time for questions and comments.
Yeah.
Anybody?
No, but I was just wondering, because I think the planners of Copenhagen, of the city of Copenhagen, they're very much in favor of taking space from the cars. When I did my interviews and I talked to planners in Copenhagen, I said, yeah, they are very much aware of that. The next step would be that we have to take away space from cars. But that is a problem, because the politicians, I think,
exactly.
are not for it.
Well, I have to say, we actually have really clever planners in Copenhagen. Sometimes people complain about planners, but I wouldn't about the ones in Copenhagen. What they do is that they don't take the fight head on, because they know they're going to lose it. So what they do is they do these small things. For instance, we're building new metro stations, and one of the big places, there has to be a new one at the central main square, Rådhusplads. What is that called? The
City Square.
City Hall Square. And the City Hall has always been a place in the city, or a space in the city that's been discussed, because it has a big road on the one side and a smaller road on the other side. It never worked. Everybody who works with planning knows that you can't have a space that is a place where people want to stay if you have traffic on too many sides, because this is not a place people stay. But it's always been, it can never be agreed that we could close the road on the inside. It goes directly into the pedestrian area, the longest walking street in Europe, shopping street in Europe, but it's never been able to be closed. But what the planners did right now, because then the metro came, and that's nothing to do, we can't do anything, and the metro had to have a fill-up area at this place, so that meant they had to take a big part of the square and had to close off that road for cars. So what the planners did was that they were really clever. So while this road has been closed up for cars, it's going to be 4 or 5 years, they kind of expanded the sidewalks, they expanded the bike path, and we don't know what the final decision is yet, because the metro, it's supposed to be done in 9. But nobody's talking about what the final decision is, if it's going to be opened up for cars yet. But what they're doing is that they're just doing like this constantly to actually, but they don't take the fight directly, because they know they're going to lose it if they take it, which I think is actually quite interesting. But in that sense, they're really good, because they figured out we need to grab a little bit here and grab a little bit there, and this is the way we get more space.
Just one follow-up question. Do you think that the decision of the Danish government to lower the taxes on car registration from 180 to 100% might affect the car ownership in Copenhagen?
Yeah, I would say we have a wonderful government these days. It's extremely neoliberal. And one of the beautiful things they did was, in Denmark it's really expensive to own a car. No, yeah. It's really expensive to buy a car, but it's not that expensive to drive in it. And it's been an ongoing discussion for the last 25 years. What would be the clever thing to do was to make the car cheaper, but make it more expensive to drive in it. And what they did was they made the car cheaper. So they listened halfway through the argument, and they fell out. And and it means a lot, because we also need to know about Denmark, that it's Copenhagen, it's Aarhus, and it's Aalborg, and Odense are the only 4 cities where people are biking more. Everywhere else in Denmark, people are biking less and less and less, and it's not much. And this is also why the figure that you showed in the beginning, on the reason why it looks like it does, and so many people are driving cars, is because outside these 4 big cities, and Copenhagen is the one where people are biking the most, people are driving cars like crazy. And this is going to make it even worse, and we can already see it on the numbers. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Just on the car driving, I wondered if you've looked at gender statistics. Are there increases in women owning cars, driving cars, vehicle miles traveled? Does anyone talk about that?
Yeah, but we don't talk about it, but there actually are increases in owning cars and driving cars, and that's to a very high degree, because more and more families get 2 cars. So there are an increase in women driving and owning cars as well. Yeah.
And in Europe, we know that it's also a class issue. Middle class women tend to become more like middle class men driving. I don't know whether this is right. We also have, urban and countryside.
Yeah.
It's of course different in the countryside.
It's
more women in the countryside. They drive cars compared to the city. Okay.
No, it's just a follow-up on Mindy's question. In Norway, at least, it's established that women are driving more, and invariably the electric car boom, which Norway is quite famous for these days, is the second car. The electric cars.
The second car. But do they drive more trips, or do they drive longer? It's probably more trips, right?
More trips.
Yeah. Because in Denmark, at least, it's still like that. The men are still driving longer trips and fewer trips, but women are the ones driving a lot of trips. Yeah.
But that gender division between, for example, driving license and owning a car, using a car, has diminished over the years, and we are at a point, at least in Norway, where it's quite equal between the genders. But the preference for public transport is much more higher in women. Than men.
And that's because they use it. Because if there's something people are really good at, it's actually having a lot of prejudice about a system that they don't use. I would say that's one of the things that's very clear for all the interviews I did. Yeah.
Any?
Can I just follow up on that statement? I think 2 days ago I checked out the statistics in Copenhagen of both income and car ownership for men and women, and of course the income has risen since 2000 a lot for Copenhagen, for both men and women, but for women particularly has risen quite a lot, and car ownership, especially for women, has also risen quite a lot in Copenhagen. Yeah. So I think there's a connection also. The car is very expensive still in Denmark to purchase and to register, but with the income, and then now with the lowering of the taxes, that of course plays a thing in there.
I was thinking of, you said that we don't have a resistance here, and that's probably right. We don't have it in the same way as you have in the US. But I was thinking of, we had this discussion about the pay ring some years ago, and as far as I know, both Oslo and Stockholm, they have pay rings. Yeah, you pay
congestion charging.
The toll station.
Yeah, congestion charging.
You pay a fee to enter, and this was suggested here by a social liberal government as one of the first really interventions, and it was so contested. These discussions were so heated, and I really wonder about the gender profile in this discussion, because it's and I always wanted to do to do a study of it, because it's really my feeling that it was men who resisted and women were.
But what is really interesting about it is there is a lot of things to say about that, and it's really interesting because the whole thing is, I'm just going to do a little bit long because it is a really interesting case of mobilities in Copenhagen. The whole thing is that the Copenhagen municipality has been working on this for a lot of years. The thing is that the municipality can't decide for a congestion charging because it's seen as a taxes, so it has to go through the national parliament. And the Copenhagen municipality had a whole unit in the municipality working on it. They knew everything. They talked about the municipalities around Copenhagen and agreed with them and made a common agreement on how can we actually get that to work, because of course the municipalities around it means a lot for their commuting. What happened was then it came through the government, and the Social Democratic Prime Minister actually went on, and it was part of her election promises that she was going to do this congestion charging. What happened was that she wanted to do things on her own, so she didn't use the work from the Copenhagen municipality, but did it on her own, and it ended up that all the suburb municipalities, they said, no, we don't want to be part of it, and the suggestion didn't work, and then we couldn't get it, and now we have to wait at least 10 years to get it up and running again. But this is coming now, and this is what is interesting. How did she actually manage to fuck it up when it was already there? I mean, that's a really interesting thing. And what happened was that suddenly, because there's nowhere else where we ever talk about any kind of mobilities that we can talk about everyday life and getting everyday life to work. It's always about work, it's always about commuting. It's never about like the everyday life organization. But suddenly it was about everyday life organization, and it was men standing on gas stations crying their eyes out because tomorrow they had to pay 10, 20 crowns to get their kids to kindergarten. So the whole gender perspective on these things suddenly changed, and it was all run through the media. So what the media did was that they had very, very little information. Nobody ever asked the questions, what is it that you want? What kind of Copenhagen do you want to have in 10 years? Because the data behind it showing how is the congestion going to be and the air pollution going to be in Copenhagen in 10 years means that we're going to have 20% more car traffic than we have now. Are you actually interested in that? That question was never asked. It was always about the here and now, everyday life perspective, and it was most of the time men who got a lot of talking time on television, in the news, everywhere on this, which is actually quite, I've used it a couple of times, but I've never done the full study, and it could be really interesting.
But isn't there a class question as well? Because Copenhagen, to live in Copenhagen within the proposed congestion charge area, I think that it's very expensive, and that there's not many people who do the cleaning and do all the work that is done in Copenhagen.
They don't live up north. Some of them live down south. There are still some of them in Copenhagen. Okay. It's getting in here that's very difficult now, but there is actually still a lot of non-profit housing in Copenhagen where they live. So there's still a lot of that, but it's down south, but it's not up north, and that's totally true, because of course that matters. But of course they had solutions for that, because I know the material the Copenhagen municipality had, and there were solutions for what happens if you have to use your car to work and your kindergarten is on the other side of the ring. Then you get a free pass, so you can put your kids to kindergarten because they know you're not going into Copenhagen, but you're driving 1 kilometer in that direction. So all of these small issues could have been handled, but they didn't. Instead, there was this everyday life perspective, mostly with men speaking about how this was actually going to be very difficult for them to handle all these small trips that an everyday life...
and also media-born.
Media-born, and they were reproducing these trips.
I think this could be really interesting to look more into, and it also includes all kinds of intersections about masculinity, about
it does.
Class, and things like that. Have you got a very final question?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to ask if that was framed as kind of failure of Social Democrats, or okay.
And
it
was
coincide with the shift to the right.
Yeah, after that, not directly, but the next election,
make a very bad start, because it was also clumsy.
It was very clumsy. There is nothing more to say.
Okay. Thank you so much.